quite strong cognitive reasons for bringing L1 and translation back. The third category, kind of lumping under humanist and intercultural. The dragoman here is, in some ways, I think, perhaps the best illustration of the inevitable intercultural role of translation. A lovely quote I came across was an English translation from a Turkish dragoman speaking in the early 19th century to a vizier. And I'll say it in English because I can't do it in Turkish. In addressing the vizier, the dragoman said, on behalf of his English ambassador friend, he said this: "Having bowed my head in submission and rubbed my slavish brow in utter humility and complete abjection and supplication to the beneficent dust beneath the feet of my mighty, gracious, condescending, compassionate, merciful benefactor, my most generous and open-handed master, I pray that the peerless and almighty provider of remedies will," etc., etc. That is a translation, almost certainly, of the English ambassador saying, "Tell him this." And the dragoman's role was not simply, of course, to translate into Ottoman, but it was to provide the sort of the cultural intermediary that was necessary. This is a very dramatic example, I think, of where we see that any kind of translation must be strongly intercultural. And of course, we are now witnessing a very strong revival of an intercultural turn in language teaching. We're talking about interculturality all of the time. If you're using or you're referring to the Common European Framework of Reference, for example, the reason why that document exists is to promote intercultural understanding. You might think it's just to sort of bore you rigid with descriptors of levels, but the point of that document is to promote intercultural understanding within European boundaries, but going beyond them. We've become interested in interculturality in language teaching. Again, it's often very explicit on the syllabuses of schools and universities. And if we are interested in interculturality, well, we've got to deal with translation, because that is the most direct way of looking at intercultural issues. There is a further point, I think, this is kind of related but more humanistic, and that is that refusing to allow the mother tongue in the classroom is, in a sense, a denial of the learner's identity, since their language is such a central part of their perception of their identity. Since we want to reaffirm learners' identities, particularly in a positive way, to ban the language is kind of not acceptable. We need to bring it back in. So we have an issue there. A final point worth making here, and this is again drawing on Rod Blyther's work from back in 1983, is that it's generally accepted that in the classroom we want students to express meanings which matter to them. Yeah? And I don't mean just personalized practice of grammar. We want them to bring their own personal meanings into the classroom. Well, most of them, of course, can't do that in the target language. Most language learning doesn't get beyond the B1 level. Most language learning is characterized by failure, in the sense they don't get beyond that level. So with the vast mass of our learners who are low level, the only way they can express their own deeply felt personal meanings is through the mother tongue. And the teacher's job is then to facilitate the expression of those meanings through the target language. Without that, they can't express any personal meanings. So, moving on, technical. We're living in a technical world now, and the biggest change that's taking place in terms of languages is probably the availability of apps and online tools for translation. Google Translate, there are others, but Google Translate is by far the best, is an extraordinary development, and there will be others that follow. Whether you approve of it or not, your students will start using it. And we need to get them using it critically and intelligently, not badly. So we need to bring it into the classroom. There's a clear technical need in terms of technical literacy. The final reasons are practical. Translation is actually an authentic activity. I mean, I'm not translating Jane Austen, but there is a practical need. How are you going to be using English or the target language in the real world out there? My daughter, we speak French at home, the only time she uses English is to translate from English into French for her friends who want to understand pop lyrics and things. Walking around the old town as a tourist, what am I hearing? This is translation taking place all of the time. This is perhaps the most authentic real-world activity that most of our students will be involved in one way or another. It is also, let's be honest, one of the most time-efficient ways of getting things done. If you have a direct equivalence between languages, well, you could try to express that through English in a roundabout way, but why not just show them that it's the same? It's time efficient. This is perhaps particularly true of vocabulary teaching. So, all of this research that's coming out, and there has been a lot in the last 10 years, is suggesting that both L1 use and translation activities should be brought back because they have much to offer in the classroom. The onus of responsibility, it would seem now, seems to rest on those who reject it as a technique to demonstrate why, rather than the responsibility lying with people like me to explain why it should be used. It's going the other way, and it's going to get stronger. Guy Cook concludes this. He says there is simply no evidence that a prescribed target language-only environment is beneficial to learners. And there is ample evidence that it may be detrimental. Okay. The second part of the title, Mutatis-Mutandis, means with the necessary changes. And I think we can summarize what these necessary changes are really very simply. One or two writers now compare translation with translating. Translation being a final product, translating being the process of getting towards a final product. When I'm talking about the activities that I will get onto now, I'm talking about translating. I'm interested in the process, not the final product. In many ways, the final product is completely irrelevant. It's the movement towards the final product and the learning opportunities that are afforded in that process that really matter. That essentially is the necessary change that needs to take place. It's normal, I think, when people talk about translation also to say, yes, but let's not overdo it. Scott Thornbury describes this as a health warning. It's self-evident that the point is to learn English, not to practice Turkish. So it's self-evident. Yes, of course we don't want to overdo it. I won't say more. The history of translation in language teaching goes back a long way. Certainly goes back at least to the 16th century. There's some debate about who was the first. Sometimes there's an English writer called Roger Ascham, who wrote a book called The Schoolmaster, who's given the credit of first using translation or recommending it. Sometimes it's Vives, the Spanish humanist. Both of these guys use a technique called reverse translation. And reverse translation is one of the fundamental activities, I think, which as teachers we need to have in our repertoires. It works like this. One person, this is one variation of it, one person will produce a sentence in either English or Turkish, doesn't really matter. Yeah? They'll whisper it to the person next to them. I'm doing it this way, but there's other variations. The person who hears this is then going to translate it into English and whisper the English to the person next to them. Okay? The person who then hears it in English is going to translate it back into Turkish and give Turkish to the person next to them. So I'd like you to think just for a second about the experiences of today. Perhaps one of the early plenary talks. Think of a short sentence which expresses your feelings about one of the talks. Yeah? Whichever language you prefer to begin in. And then if we start perhaps with the people at the ends of the rows, yeah, this end and that end, whisper your sentence in whichever language the person next to you, who will translate it and pass it on to the next. If you are unfortunately monolingual, well, you just have to pass it on in the English to the next person. Try it for a second, yeah? Okay, you get the idea, yeah? That's one way of doing it. That's a fairly lively way of running a classroom activity, but it doesn't, of course, have to be done there. The central idea of reverse translation can be done in many ways. You can do it on pieces of paper, of course, if you want to make it more written-focused. One useful technique that I've found of this is to use this as a way of revising material you've done in class before. If you're using a course book, for example, we tend to sort of go through the material and try to get onto the next stuff without really thinking about what's come before. I would prefer to skip a page or two completely and go back to previous material. And one way of doing this would be very simple, is to maybe a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks after looking at a particular text, is to take a short paragraph from that text, 5 or 6 lines perhaps, which will be in English, translate it into Turkish, it won't take you terribly long, and then hand out that Turkish translation to your students, whose job is then to translate it back into English. Yeah? They will want to cheat. They'll want to open their books to find out what the original answer is. Fine, but don't let them. And the wonderful thing about this kind of activity is that you don't even need to really do feedback, because once you say, okay, stop, you can open your books, they will all want to compare. And that's the kind of motivated language learning which I would like to promote in classrooms, where I don't even have to tell them what to do, they want to do it. So this basic technique of reverse translation is one that you can play around with. I'd like to throw a few more at you. Give students a text. Don't ask them to translate it. Ask them that they're going to have to, tell them they're going to have to translate it, and with a partner or in a small group, to underline all the things that they will find difficult to translate. Yeah, that's it. And they'll go at it for a long, long time. And they'll start translating anyway, because the discussion about what's easy or difficult to translate is going to lead to translation. And that inevitably will then lead into some kind of whole class discussion about the problems, weaknesses, strengths of the different students. So actually approaching it in that way, in a natural way, what are you going to find difficult? Let's have a look at it collectively. Again, it's the exchange between the students where the learning is going to be taking place. That's what really matters. Another thing that I find works quite well is, rather than just doing straightforward translations, translate this, is with longer texts, again perhaps from course books, if you're going to revise material, is to give them the translations of the difficult words. Because of course so many students are going to think that translation is essentially about finding the translated individual words. What we're interested in as language teachers is not really the words, it's how the words are put together. That's the challenge. So if we give them the words, which are going to be difficult anyway, it facilitates their task and makes them focus on the syntax and the morphology rather than the problems with the individual words. You can make this a little bit more challenging by giving them the translations of the words they'll find difficult, but mixing them up. So you don't tell them which words these refer to, but you're identifying where they may have problems. Again, a very simple activity. Another very simple activity using translation in class is that they listen to a text of some kind. The text might be the teacher speaking, it might be listening, and get them to take notes in their mother tongue. It's very, very hard, except at the very highest levels, and even then, to listen to someone speaking and take notes in that language. Often what we'll do is we'll mix the languages. If I'm listening to French and I'm bilingual, I will take notes in both English and French. Encourage your students to do that. Yeah? It's as simple as that. Something which is used fairly frequently is bad translations, and I'm interested in bad translations. I don't want to go too far down the path. The image here is of a kebab house in Times Square in New York, and the menu underneath tells you what you're going to get. So you get layers of marinated ground meat wrapped around the large vertical split and grilled in front of an ingenious herd of charcoal fire. Now, those of you who speak good Turkish can almost certainly tell me why the translation has become this. Yeah? This, again, seems to be something which is terribly useful. Identifying where translations have gone wrong, they can be fun. I think we need to be very careful to avoid laughing at other cultures who have problems. I think you need to be sensitive about it. But if you're using your own culture, there's really not an issue. And you are living in a city which is surrounded by bad translations. They're everywhere. English bad translations are absolutely everywhere. Walking around as a tourist, you know, people are hassling me a little bit up in the old town, and they're saying things like, nice couple, as a way of addressing me. Well,